So, welcome to the May edition of the Sacred Wheel Speaker Series. I am Allison Carr, and today I am speaking to Melanie St. If you haven't joined us before, the Sacred Wheel Speaker Series is a series I'm doing this year where each month I talk to a new speaker around the general theme of how we can create a world of peace, beauty, justice, and delight. Today, because it's May, we are speaking to Melanie St. about the topic of desire. So welcome, Melanie. Do you want to give everybody a little introduction to who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Allison. I practice herbal medicine, and my relationship with Allison has brought me a little bit outside of the wheelhouse of what I normally do. But I have a background before becoming an herbalist. I had a deep background and in the arts, and in addition to my own sort of spiritual path, which is definitely very deeply woven with the earth as an herbalist. That's, I think, inevitable. I hope inevitable for herbalists.
Mm-hmm.
But what has really come forward in my relationship and teaching with Allison is this real emphasis on like deep story and myth and the ways that we as humans make meaning and crave meaning. That's actually, I think, big medicine. So even though in my day-to-day work, I'm much more thinking about, people's symptoms and suffering and herbs and food and bolstering and fixing that way, I think this is the stream of big medicine that we all need to be immersed in all the time to stay well and to become our most full selves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for those of you that don't know either of us, what Melanie's alluding to is that we teach a class together, or we have taught some classes together in the past. So, and I'm so excited she's here today because I love working with her and we have a great dynamic. And every time we talk, something new comes up. So Let's talk about desire, Melanie.
Yes.
Tell me, what do you wish, or what do you wish people knew, or what do you feel like is the most important thing around desire that is often misunderstood or not conveyed?
Yeah. The first thing is, I think we have to understand on a biophysiological level what desire actually is and what its evolutionary purpose is. So desire is really that which calls us to life and calls us back to life. And the biochemical experience of desire has a lot to do with dopamine, which, if you know anything about your brain, there's the joke that the only two things you ever enjoy are dopamine and serotonin, that you can boil most pleasures down to those. And if we get really overly simple, serotonin is the pleasure of having, of satisfaction. But actually the more powerful pleasure, and the thing that is more easily disturbed with addictive drugs and substances, and in fact that's involved in even behavioral addictions like gambling and sex addiction, is dopamine, which is the chemical of wanting. And when it is functioning in the proper way in our bodies, this chemical of wanting is like the little, like that saying from the Talmud of every blade of grass has an angel hanging over it whispering, grow, grow. That's what dopamine is meant to do for us when it's operating in the right way. It's saying, come eat this good food that will nourish you. Come connect with this lovely person who you might be able to make a beautiful baby with, or who you can create a beautiful life with. Come learn this kind of hard thing that's going to make you feel really successful when you conquer it. And so that energy of wanting, that energy of desire is about breaking us out of stagnation and taking us into the next deeper level of living and being called out into the community beyond the boundaries of our individual selves.
I love that idea of looking first at how desire should function within the ecosystems that we live in. In my Sacred Wheel series, all my students, we've just come through Beltane, and all the themes that we're talking about are that return to life and how that's so needed and necessary, right? For the wheel to turn, there has to be a time where we like want to re-engage again, where we, want to celebrate joy. And there's almost this like need for that ecstatic sort of connection between things. It happens with the plants, it happens with the humans, it happens with the animals. So how does that go wrong?
Well, I think it's like the Charles Dickens thing of like, there's only one story about a happy family, but there are so many stories about unhappy families, right? There are so many ways for anything to go wrong. I think that the two biggest, if I had to sort of boil it down, the two biggest things that I see are kind of an over renunciation. So that would be the path of self-denial to the point that it inhibits growth.
Yeah.
So this is not at all about genuine renunciate spiritual paths that are consciously chosen, and they're harsh, but the path is designed that way, and there are traditions and support for it. I'm talking about sort of a half-conscious renunciation that is not really within an explicit spiritual context. It has more to do with just a reflexive, usually fear-based denial of desire. That's one way. And the other way is really what I would call addiction. And that doesn't mean just clinical addiction. That means being so caught up in the wanting that you never get to the growth. Yeah. And you never actually get off of the cycle. You don't have the turning of the wheel. You just have that continual hunger,
right?
Continual stoking. And, in our culture, there are influences that push in both directions. Certainly American culture has a puritanical heritage and a lot of sort of built-in prohibitions about sexuality and the expression of sexual desire. Certain kinds of desires are considered good and normal, and others are kinky or bad or weird or aberrant. And then there's like the flip over reaction of that to the over sexualization and so much online pornography and this kind of thing that's like always more and more and more stimulation until real people no longer can do it for you. So I think we can look at it, we can do the same thing with food, diet culture, self-denial, feeling like anything that tastes really good is a bad food and it's bad, this moral judgment on food. And then at the same time, there are more calories per capita that we quote unquote have to consume in order to eat all the food that's being produced for us.
Right.
So there's there's no room in the middle. Does that give kind of a good overview?
Yep. And I think that push-pull that you're talking about between denial on one side and then sort of empty, I don't know. I often think of addiction as being empty desire, right? Because it never actually gets fulfilled, or the moment in which it gets fulfilled is so fleeting. There's that, I think that push-pull exists in so many places in our culture. Let's dive in a little deeper into the denial side. Because as you were talking, I was just like, oh my gosh, yes, there's so much we could unpack here. So obviously there's always the argument that like we can't satisfy all of our desires, like there would be chaos. But what is your answer to that idea? It truly is desire dangerous?
Well, I don't know if there's a single answer to that, but what I would say is that we have to remember it's like that idea of ecosystem is really important. I think that right now, and having a strong sense of your individual self is very healthy, but we have to remember that your life is not just about you. You are in relationship with your environment, with your community, with everybody that you owe money, with every institution that owes you something. We're tied into a web. So there are places where you might have a desire that is harmful, in which case part of what we rely on is the input from the community and from the environment to tell you, no, this is not a good desire. So for example, if you have the desire, to steal something, and stealing, it gives a very strong dopamine rush, like this, there's a reason why people become addicted to shoplifting. So if you have that desire, if somebody is shoplifting, and this is a desire that when fulfilled can undermine a local economy, can cause harm to the business owner, it's not helpful for the whole ecosystem. When that happens, there are checks and balances to stop you from doing it. So hopefully before you go to that point where you satisfy that desire, same thing with addictive drugs, hopefully you have enough education and self-love to never start going down that path with either shoplifting or doing dangerous drugs. But if you do start down that path and your desire starts to cause harm to you or to others, the next built-in protection is the feedback from the community. So I think one way to work with this, if you feel like you are kind of an overly renunciate kind of person, like you're always telling yourself no, or and generally people, on some level, if you're being too hard on yourself, a really good thing to do is kind of check it out with some friends or with other people in your life. Like check it out and say, hey, like, I have savings and like, I pay all my bills and stuff, but I still feel like I shouldn't even take myself out to the movies, or I shouldn't even let myself get, a new dress once a season. Am I really, like, is that really reasonable? Like, does this feeling of guilt really come from the fact that I should be giving more to charity, or am I just holding myself back for no reason?
Yeah. And as you were talking, I had this sort of aha moment where I was like, oh, and also bringing it on a cultural level, part of what's wrong with desire in our world right now is that web is broken down a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So even within the context that you're talking about, that web of like, many of us don't live in local economies. Many of us live in corporate economies where that feedback web of like what is right or wrong has started to break down. And so you don't see the immediate feedback of how your actions affect those around you because they're not affecting the people that you live with. They're affecting a larger group, like a corporate structure. And who knows what that is.
Some sort of faceless.
Yeah. How many people feel connected to that?
Yes.
And then the piece about the community web, I think, is really, really important. And I want to highlight here too, this idea that, so for many people, the community structure in the past historically has created some harm around desire, right? Because there are certain things in our world now that are considered okay to desire. Like, let's talk about same-sex unions for a second. That used to be really taboo and used to be kind of a culturally created thing.
Used to be illegal. Used to be punishable by death.
Yep. And still not okay in many communities in our country. So how do we then tap into and sort of conquer those demons that have been created by the social structures around us? I mean, I'm not asking you to have an answer, but let's talk about this a little bit. Like, what about when desire does conflict with the community groups around?
Well, I mean, I think the answer to this depends on the person, because obviously when you are marginalized enough and your safety is at risk enough, and only you and other people who stand in your position can determine that, but there are times when for a period of time, it's not safe to be out there and to show yourself and to engage in this way. But I think particularly for those of us who are in an ally role, and for those of us who are in a space where there is pushback or challenge to our core desires, our ability to live, our ability to be our authentic, true selves, but we have some amount of privilege and aren't really in immediate danger.
Mm-hmm.
I think that here is where there is we need more connection, not less.
Yeah.
And in fact, we need more connection across boundaries of difference.
Mm.
And by this, I don't mean necessarily more arguments on Facebook,
Mm-hmm.
but like thinking about fixing that web of connection,
Mm-hmm.
including people who are different from
Mm-hmm.
us,
Mm-hmm.
is really important. And I think it's amazing because I didn't really plan this, but I think the animal research actually really bears this out, because in all of the research that they've done on rats with addiction, rats will self-administer cocaine, which is like, dopamine trigger, will self-administer cocaine until they starve to death, because they'll push that button rather than eat or drink.
Mm-hmm.
However, only rats in deprived environments do this.
Mm-hmm.
Rats that are living in a really cool, enriched environment with other rats where they can be social, where they can express their personalities, they're actually fairly complex, smart creatures. When they have their full web intact, they don't go down this path. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to remember that like your personal health and well-being is not separate from that of the community, and that the members of your community who are expressing their sickness by being hateful,
Mm-hmm.
they need the medicine of connection too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's up to us to judge. I'm not suggesting anybody to be self-sacrificing here in a negative way, but it's up to us to see the connection between the other, who we might think, some sort of hateful right-winger, right? Like to the extent that that person is expressing a sickness, it's not separate from us.
Mm.
And it's so tempting to make it feel separate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's all coming back to that web, and how healthy is that web?
Mm-hmm.
Like everything we're talking about is all kind of coming back to that web of community. And I think that's another good sort of guideline, like you were saying at the beginning. Do my desires actually enrich the web? Do they make it stronger? Do they make my community more healthy? Like if I am the happy person that I want to be, that actually affects the world around me, that makes my community happy. And if it doesn't, then you need to look at either your desires or your community,
Yes. And yes, totally. And I think, happiness can be a byproduct, but I really think we have to think about healthy desire in terms of growth.
Yeah.
Because desire, coming more from the Eastern traditions, especially the Buddhist tradition, the idea of like desire is the root of all suffering. Well, guess what? It is. Like, it totally is. And also, you can't have suffering without life. So it's almost like transitive power that like, well, desire is the root of life and what pulls us forward into life. And life entails suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So how are we going to work with this? For me, it's like, well, if I think that I'm here having a human experience for the growth of my soul and my being, then if I have to suffer, but there's growth involved, if I have to work hard, but it helps me grow, if I have to encounter someone unpleasant, and there's a chance in that encounter for both of us to grow, then I have to like move toward that desire, even knowing that suffering might be part of it. It might not always just be what the sort of consumer narrative of desire that like, I'm going to get this thing and then everything will be awesome, because we all know how rarely that works out,
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up too, because one of the things we talk about in my class around this time of year is that it's this idea that like, you can't experience any of the range of human emotions to their fullest extent unless you're willing to experience all of them, right? So you're never going to be as joyful as you can be unless you're absolutely willing to be as devastated as you can be. And I think a lot of our culture operates on this very midline of like, well, if I don't get too happy, I won't be too sad. If I avoid being too sad, I never can actually be really elated. And
Yes.
you can't have one without the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
They balance
Mm-hmm.
each other out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what have we left out about desire? Anything you wish to add?
Oh, that broke up a little bit.
Oh,
Can you say
what
that
have
one
we
more time?
left out?
What have we
Anything?
left out? Um, well, I think this may just be revealing a little bit of my personal way of like piece of working with this now, but I think it's worth saying a little bit specifically about sexual desire
Yeah.
here.
Yep.
And I think, um, I think that there is a real sense of trying to find and work with the difference, especially for people who have grown up in a culture like ours, where there are a lot of messages about sexuality that are strong, no matter your gender. I'm not sure how it is for non-binary people, where there just hasn't been quite as much conversation. I don't know if maybe then you're just left with like the binary versions of stuff and just try to unpack and find something new.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like there's a real question of like, how do you get to find, express, and enjoy your own authentic sexual desire,
Mm-hmm.
and navigate that in a way that is true to yourself within kind of the boundaries of the culture. And I think, this is where that sense of desire calling you back to life, I think, is so important to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. That like your sexuality is a gift that is entirely yours, mm-hmm. and entirely yours to share with others as you wish to or as you don't wish to. Mm-hmm. And it is meant to be a vivifying and creative force, yep. Whether that is about like procreating human children of your own, biological or not. Mm-hmm. So I don't know is this something that comes up a lot in the work that you do, or?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. I was just thinking of an exercise. So one of the most sort of revealing things one of my teachers said to me once was, we were doing a workshop on gender, and she said, my gender is green. My gender is the color green, right? So we're now in this place where thankfully we can break down these ideas of like, oh, my gender is female, my gender is male, my gender is masculine, my gender is feminine, right? We actually now live in a world where some of us live in a world, and all of us could live in a world where we're free to create the gender expression that we truly wish, right? And the binary exists as this sort of opposite poles that pull people in certain directions. And a lot of us find the binary convenient for certain things that in that way, but many people don't. So if you remove gender, the gender expression from the idea of the binary, what is your true gender? And how can you express that? One of the exercises I sometimes give my students is to write about what your gender is without using the words masculine, feminine, male, female, any of those. Like, what actually would your gender be if you're not allowed to use those words, right? And the clues that we use to talk about that are, what are the things that make you feel most alive, that make you feel sexy, that make you feel desirable, right? And all of those things do not have to relate to either your biological sex or the gender binary that has given us these ways of, like, I see it as just a code of kind of an external code of like signaling people how to relate to you, right? But it works for some and it doesn't work for many. So then how do we create the code, right? What would you want your code to be if you could wear it on your skin? And give people an idea of how to relate to you? That's gender expression. Does this fit into what you're talking about?
Yeah, it's so interesting for me, as a person. Like I could always really empathize with trans men in the sense, because I inside feel so feminine and so much like a woman. And like as a little girl, if I had a sort of haircut, like a haircut where it was not obvious that I was a girl to people, and somebody like misgendered me, how upset I would feel to my core. So like in that sense, I always have felt like, well, I don't know what it feels like to be a non-normative gender, but I know what it feels like to be very certain of like who and what I am. And it happens to fit easily into something I can easily communicate to others. But what can get lost, and whenever language is convenient, you can fall into cliche. And I think this is a big thing that can happen with sexuality when it's been in the shadow, is like, if you try to talk dirty in bed, or you try to like write something erotic, and all that comes out are cliches. Or if you try to talk about your gender identity or your sexual expression, and all that comes out are kind of like, standard words. What it can signal is that there is, instead of your authentic self, you haven't yet found a way for that to fully shine through, and you're relying on shorthand or sort of like a rough sketch instead of a really well-rendered picture. And it occurs to me that the exercise of sort of taking away those cliches, or taking away those obvious words, would force me to really like get creative about how I would express it. And I would be bound to discover some things that might not change my day-to-day experience or expression, because I happen to be in a pretty easy situation in that regard. But it could bring forward more self. And I think that's what we always want to be doing, is like bringing forward more self. And the more that we do that, like that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a little bit of unasked for homework for anybody listening. If you want to write a paragraph about what your gender is, but you're not allowed to use those kind of cliched signifiers, right? I would even say that you're not allowed
even not non-binary.
Yeah.
Because that just says what it's not. That doesn't
aggressive.
say what you are.
Yep, exactly. Yep, non-binary, masculine, feminine. I even would like receptive, whatever the opposite of receptive is. Any of those. Like, see if you can write a paragraph about what your gender is, removing all of those stereotypes. Yeah. We don't often give homework on this interview series, but there it is. So in closing, let's wrap this up. I don't know what to ask to end. Where do we need to go? Where do you see we need to grow and stretch around desire?
I think it's a lot like, I'm sure you've seen this in clinical practice. You get the people who come to you who really, they need to eat like richer, fattier food, and all they want to do is go on a juice fast. And then you get the people who really are struggling to give up kind of heavy, frequent meals, and really they need to be eating steamed veggies and rice to give their system a break. Sometimes our habitual, the things that we want because they're comfortable, we need to question them and go a level deeper to the deeper desire. So I think that if you're having trouble with this, you can just say, well, one question would be, how could this help me grow? Is this going to help me grow? Is there something new here? We're talking, it's May, and like the green shoots are bursting forth. It's all about newness. And the tree wants to grow up into the light because that's the direction of its flowering. So ask about growth, and then ask about, do I just want this because it's what I've always let myself want? If I were going to want something a little, to use Rob Beresne's language, like a little bigger, wilder, wetter, more fabulous, bigger dreams, bigger desires, what would that be? And if you can break habit and move toward growth, and nobody, and people that you love and trust don't come and say to you like, hey, like, you got to stop like stealing. I know that you think that blankety blank is like a terrible corporate overlord, but like you really can't like shoplift as a way of correcting that. You know what I mean? Like, if you can do those three things, I think you're going to be on a good track.
Yeah. Yeah. Which reminds me, just in closing, of something a friend once said to me, which is, we were talking about greed, which is kind of the opposite or the antithesis of desire, but what a lot of people associate with desire. And she was like, actually, I think the antidote to greed is true nourishment.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yes.
Greed is this idea of trying to just, fill your face or your pockets or your hedge fund or your bank account or whatever with as much as possible without even thinking about how it nourishes you. And I would say desire really at its core is that which pulls us towards nourishment, which is
and it leaves us vulnerable.
Yeah,
it leaves us vulnerable. Those new shoots of the trees are very tender, very vulnerable. And greed is about amassing more and more in an effort to defend against death and impermanence.
Right.
Desire is so tender. It's like it's like a perfectly roasted tomato where like you just press on the skin a little bit and it oozes, and you're just it's like so full and tender that you can't even contain it.
Right.
So when you're in that place and you're vulnerable like that, it's the antithesis of greed, which is really keeping everything and everybody out and pushing away.
Mm-hmm. And one last piece I would say in that tomato example, it was like desire is the art of being present, right? Greed is the art of not being present, right? You're not even present with what your fears are. You just want more and more and more. Whereas desire is kind of coming home to that presence of like, what is actually here and what am I drawn towards?
And how full of desire can you become on the path to satisfaction? That's a good thing to practice sexually too. There are a lot of good metaphors there. Like how full can you be before you let yourself be satisfied or you let the game be over.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about how people can find you if they want to connect with you and things that you might offer.
Sure. So most of my work is pretty different from this. If I work a lot with chronic illness, women's health complaints, and mental health. And so if you're interested in herbal medicine and in that kind of work, I have an introductory session, which is an assessment. So we'll kind of check out your situation and see if it's a good fit. And you can find out more about that at psycheandsoma.com.
Okay.
And if you don't have a personal health related need at this time, but you kind of like enjoy my style and want to learn more and just kind of talk about meaningful stuff and herbal medicine, I'm currently teaching a free series on YouTube live on my channel. You can just search my name and find it. And we last month did the foundations of herbal medicine. And this month in May, we're talking about specific traditions from around the world. And then in June, actually June is going to be the month that I think your people are going to love the most, Allison. We're really talking about the archetype of the wounded healer and going very deep into that for over the course of four classes. So that YouTube series might be something that that you guys would be interested to come and listen to. And you can join us live or just listen to the recordings, but classes are on either Tuesdays or Wednesdays at 7 Eastern.
Nice. And we'll include links to both your website and then probably can put a link to your YouTube channel below the video or the podcast. And I just want to say, you give the caveat of like, what I do is so different, but this is who you are, Melanie. And I don't know about people out there, but I personally, if I were to heal or speak the way you do, I'd be like, that's the person I want to work with because this informs everything you do, right?
Yeah,
this informs how you work with healing. So you may not talk about this explicitly with your patients, but this is part of who you are.
That is true. That if I've learned one thing, it's that if you want to do healing work, you have to be along for the full ride and you have to walk your talk and you have to bring your whole self. And otherwise, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. You
can't phone it in.
Nope.
So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
And
you.
you're welcome. And like I said before, we're going to have links to Melanie's website and YouTube channel included. If you would like to hear more of these interview series, if you'd like to join me for past or future versions of the Sacred Wheel Speaker Series, there's always also a link included with the video or the podcast that lets you sign up for updates, and I'll email you every time there's a new episode. So thank you for joining us. Again, I'm Allison Carr, and I'm speaking with Melanie St. today. Bye, everybody.
Bye.